Last year, I wanted to take the family on a trip somewhere nice, and we settled on Sardinia, Italy. The warm weather and fun activities were supposed to be a great change for the 10-year-old twins, Georgie and Dawn. My husband, Jack, and I, we are registered nurses, and we do shift work to ensure one of us was at home with the kids. Money was tight. A family friend, who worked for a travel agency, helped us out and put together an 8-day family package to Sardinia within budget. The trip started off amazing, and the kids had a blast at the water parks, aquariums, and even rock pooling. We had a rented car which gave us freedom to drive to the local towns and eat at the local restaurants. On the third night, after dinner, we were returning to the hotel when we took a wrong turn. The roads were narrow, and lighting was not great either. Usually, Jack had great sense of direction, but we got turned around this time. He pulled the car to the side of the road and looked at the GPS on his phone. It was getting late, and the kids were fast asleep in the back. I turned around to check on them and reached over to pull the blanket up over their shoulders. When I straightened up, I noticed a shape behind the car standing a few meters away. At first, I thought I was seeing things. I touched my husband's shoulder and pointed at the figure. He turned and mumbled expletives in shock before locking the car doors. It looked like a man, and he was not moving, but standing completely still. Jack thought maybe he needed help, and it would not be right to leave him here, in the middle of nowhere, if he was not well. Thinking as a nurse, he wondered if the man was suffering from a mental illness. We did not know if he was dangerous, and we struggled with our conscience before Jack slowly opened the car door and walked towards the figure. He stopped next to the car taillight and said, "Hello, do you need help? Can we call someone?" There was no response. Jack suddenly ran back, jumped into the car, and slammed the gas pedal hard. The kids woke up startled as we drove above the speed limit in the dark, narrow road. The seatbelt warning sign kept pinging as Jack drove in silence to the hotel. Georgie and Dawn both stared at Jack in fear, not understanding what just happened. I put on a cartoon on my phone for them to watch until we reached the hotel. Jack remained silent and stony-faced the whole time. About 15 minutes later, we parked the car, gathered our belongings, and ushered the kids into the hotel. After putting the kids to bed, I turned and looked at Jack. "What happened back there?" I asked him. He whispered. I could not see him clearly, even with the taillight of the car. It seems he was engulfed in darkness and light was not reaching him, Jack mumbled. The weirdest thing was I could not see his ankles or shoes below his trousers. It looked like he was floating, and he kept his head down all the time, not even looking at me once. I checked that the kids were still asleep and said it was late and we should go to sleep. We had a hectic day ahead of us, and the kids were excited to visit the cave system in Alshiro. My husband was a skeptic and did not believe in supernatural. However, he looked well shook that night. The following days went as planned, but Jack looked preoccupied and distant, like he had something weighing on his mind. He always made a point to get us home by 8 in the evening, and I would find him in the hotel bar drinking. He would come to bed drunk and would pass out. A couple of days before we were due to leave, I woke up in the middle of the night. I wondered what woke me and looked over at the kids. They were sound asleep. I turned over to look at Jack, who was wide awake and was staring at me with horror in his face, and standing next to him, by the side of the bed next to his head, was the dark figure. I screamed and jumped out of bed, turning on the lamps, and grabbed the kids. When I turned around, the figure was gone. I turned on all the lights in the room, even the bathroom, and looked around. Jack was now sitting with the kids in the twin bed, comforting them. I screamed, "What was that?" Jack explained that every night since they saw that figure on the road, he kept seeing it in the middle of the night at the foot of the bed. That's why he kept drinking to numb himself up, and besides, he thought he was going crazy. When he woke up that night, he found the figure leaning over him. There was a dark abyss where his face should have been. Jack felt like it was sucking the life out of him. He could not talk and was gripped by a blinding fear. He was able to turn his head away from it and nudged me with his elbow. We sat there in silence when Dawn broke the silence. "Are you talking about the old man who walks around the room at night?" We knew then that we had to cut our trip short. Whatever we had encountered on that road had attached itself to Jack, and we had to leave. While packing, I noticed a new charm attached to the keychain on Jack's wallet. He usually clipped his wallet to his trouser when at work to avoid losing it or misplacing it. The charm had weird symbols on it and looked antic. I raised it up and asked Jack since when he had this new charm and where he got it. He just smiled weakly and said Dawn found it and put it in the keychain. I noted that one of the symbols was a pentagram. I woke Dawn up and asked her where she found this. My suspicion was soon confirmed. Dawn mumbled sleepily that she found it while rock pooling and thought it would look great on the keyring. The next flight back home was in a couple of hours, which left us enough time to make a quick stop at a church on the way. We walked in and explained what happened to us to the priest and handed the strange coin to him. He said this pentacle might have been used in some sort of ritual in the past, and if one was to believe in dark magic, then it can be assumed that the dark figure was attached to the coin somehow. We could not get to the airport fast enough. It was a 6-day trip we will never forget. I can confirm that there was no further incident when we got back home. I did go through all the suitcases with a fine-tooth comb to ensure there was nothing else in there. I got the house blessed by a priest and burnt sage around the house for a month. I had nightmares for months before I was able to fully put it all behind me. Jack is back to his old self, though he is no longer a skeptic. This incident happened during a restoration project for a hotel in Florida during the COVID lockdown. This 210-room hotel looked like it was stuck in time in the 18th century, with its Baroque-style decor and the breathtaking artworks covering the ceilings. The major problem with this project was upgrading the building to the 21st century without altering or damaging the prized artworks and architecture. A burst pipe a couple of years ago had obliterated the mural in the ballroom, and to contain the damage, the hotel was shut down pending repairs. The owners did not have the finance to restore the mural or replace the plumbing, wiring, and various other facilities which guests expect in a luxury hotel. The hotel changed hands just before Christmas, and I was appointed to oversee the renovation and manage any issues that arise. One of the issues I had not expected in a million years was ghosts, spirits, or demons, as some of the workers had mumbled in terror. We have all heard stories of murdered spirits wandering the halls of hotels seeking justice, vengeance, or an escape into the afterlife and howling in pain or anguish. With COVID lockdown and social distancing, only a handful of team members were allowed to work on the premise at any time, which significantly delayed the completion of the project. The plumbers mentioned hearing children laughing and running down the hall, and their giggles echoing throughout the hallway. When they investigated, there were no one else on that floor apart from them. The conservators who were working on the murals and paintings restoration swore they saw a couple in evening attire walk past the ballroom towards the dining room. By the time the workers walked over to the door, the couple was gone and the dining room was empty. After each task was completed, I would inspect the job, and usually I had one of the supervisors with me, taking note, but today Damien had to take his daughter to the hospital. I was already at the hotel, and instead of waiting for another supervisor to get to the site, I decided to inspect the 4th floor on my own. I grabbed my notepad and camera and made my way up the stairs. A door slammed shut in the distance. I paused and checked the work schedule for any personnel on site. There was no work scheduled for that day. I texted site security and asked them to take a look around. The fourth floor was recarpeted, painted, and some of the windows were replaced. I walked around from room to room and making notes for discussion with the supervisors when I noticed movement in the corner of my eyes. I looked up and walked to the bathroom. There was no one here. I chalked it up to my imagination, and the ghost comments from staff was obviously getting to me. I shut my notepad and took some pictures. There were cracked marbles in the bathroom that needed fixing, and the windows were not installed properly. There was a draft coming through, and the room was quite chilly. Next, I tested the remote, which failed the inspection last time. I pressed the remote to close the curtain and checked the newly installed ceiling lights and dimmed the light to the lowest setting. I looked over my shoulder, sensing a presence, and nearly fell over. There was a man standing in the dark corridor. He looked angry and was glaring at me with an intense hatred. I then noticed the knife in his hand, and there was a red stain on it. Was that blood? In my struggle to find my phone while backing away from the door, I had turned the lights back up. I speed-dialed security and grabbed the nearest lamp as a weapon, only to find the man was nowhere to be seen. "Mike," one of the site securities answered. I explained the situation and asked them to come to room 181. I assumed the door I heard slamming earlier was this guy, and he somehow got into the hotel. I did not leave the room until Mike's younger colleague arrived. There was a smirk on his face and said there was no one in the corridor, and he had checked the security camera before he made his way to the room. Apart from me, no one else was on the fourth floor. Feeling well embarrassed, I picked up my camera and notepad and left the room to carry on my round. I have worked in a lot of construction sites, and I have never acted like a damsel in distress, needing to be rescued. This will leave a dent in the hard-ass image I had cultivated. The security guards were chuckling as they walked out of the room. I carried on with the inspection while they waited for me to finish. An hour later, I packed up and walked to their office, asking to view the security recordings of the fourth floor. It showed me walking around, going into room 181, and then the security guards arriving 10 minutes later. Did I have a hallucination, or was something more sinister walking the halls of this hotel? A few weeks later, I was able to get more information on the history of the hotel. A newlywed couple, Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Thompson, were murdered in room 181 in 1809. The older brother, Charles, was disowned by the family due to substance abuse and squandering away the family fortune. Daniel was made CEO and given full control of the family business, whereas Charles was given a stipend to stay away and asked to avoid any further scandals. Charles had other ideas. He figured that with his brother and sister-in-law out of the picture, he would inherit the family fortune. He followed them to the hotel and bribed a maid for their room key. In the early hours of the morning, Charles went into their room and stabbed them to death. Police found him heavily intoxicated, walking down the road covered in blood before anyone even knew that the couple were savagely murdered in their bed. Charles lost grip on reality and slowly went insane. This is my encounter with the supernatural, and I will always wonder, had I not turned the lights up, what would have happened? I work in a quaint 80-room boutique hotel in a small town in Iowa. Growing up, I would accompany my dad and help around the hotel during the weekend. You see, he was the handyman and tended to odd jobs in the hotel, fixing the showers, painting, fixing the washing machine, and the list goes on. When my dad had a stroke, I had to drop out of school to find work, and the hotel manager offered me my dad's job, which helped pay the bills. Over the years, I heard a lot of stories about this one room on the third floor, room 76. When I hit puberty, like many teenagers, I experimented with a lot of things, and one of them was smoking. A couple of my friends and I would hide in a shed at the back of the hotel and smoke. No one ever came out there except the gardener, who usually worked in the mornings. One day, we heard a commotion, and one of the chambermaids came running out of the hotel crying. The hotel manager, Tristan, followed her outside, asking her to explain her behavior. She had scared the guests with her hysterical crying. She was hugging herself and rocking back and forth, praying. After a couple of minutes, she looked up at Tristan and said in a hoarse voice that she was in room 76, changing the bedding. She was tucking in the bed linen under the mattress and was bent down. She saw something under the bed. It was a little boy lying on his stomach, staring right at her. He was wearing only his bottom pajama, and his skin color looked gray. He did not look human, and then he screamed an inhuman, unnatural scream. She buried her face in her hands, stomping the foot on the ground, trying not to wail. Tristan looked concerned and gave her a hug. After a while, she calmed down, and I never saw her at the hotel again. There was a rumor that she was interned in a psych ward for a few months, and then her family moved out of state. Some guests say they woke up in the middle of the night to find a boy walking around the room and disappeared when they turned on the lights. Others would say certain areas of the room had cold spots. Personally, I had not seen the little boy or anything paranormal. Guests have been complaining about flickering lights in room 76. I went to inspect the room and found nothing visibly wrong with the sockets or light bulbs. Later in the afternoon, I let Nick, the electrician, in the room to check the wiring for any faults and went to chat with Lucy, the chambermaid, in the hallway. Nick popped his head out of the door and said, "Hey, does the kid's parent know where he is? I assume there is no guest staying in this room?" Confused, I asked, "What kid?" He said, as he turned to point towards the wall. "There is a kid scratching at the wall in the corner." He stopped mid-sentence and went pale. He looked around and said, "I think he's hiding somewhere." We turned the room upside down, and there was no sign of any kid. Nick was a new contractor. He did not know about the room 76 rumor, and now he has a story to tell his friends over campfires. He looked perturbed, shook his head, opened his toolbox, and carried on with his work. While checking the wiring, he found a damp spot where he said the kid was scratching the wall, and when he pulled back the wallpaper, there was mold infestation. There might be water leakage in the wall, which could be affecting the electrical wires and pose a serious fire hazard. After cutting off the electricity to the room, we took a hammer to the wall and made a hole big enough to look. Nick shined a light inside. It looked more spacious than expected, and something was not right. He poked his head inside with the torch in his mouth and screamed, dropping the torch inside, and backed away from the wall in terror. "The little boy, the little boy," he kept saying and pointing at the hole. I looked at Tristan, and without a word, we both leaned over. With the light from the torch Nick had dropped, we saw the skeletal remain of a little boy leaning against the wall, hugging his knees. He was wearing the bottom of his pajamas, and I could see his ribcage. This was once a small walk-in closet, and there were scratches on the wall, which would mean the child was alive when he was walled in. Apparently, when Nick poked his head in, he came face to face with the boy, well, his ghost. Police was called, and they taped off the room, pending investigation. The coroner estimated his age to be around 5 or 6 years old. He was malnourished and died of suffocation. The hotel was previously a private residence. In the 17th century, a wealthy family built the mansion and held lavish parties for royalties and members of the high society. From the town records, there was a midwife report that the daughter of the mansion owner fell pregnant and gave birth to a boy. However, there was no trace of the boy after that. The daughter chose to self-exit a few years later. They did not have any living descendants or anyone authorities could trace. The town folks decided to arrange for the boy to be buried next to his mother. Well, that's the least anyone can do for the boy. No one knew his name, and they inscribed baby boy on his headstone. The room was refurbished, and the wardrobe removed to be replaced with a small window and an armchair. Staff reported that they can still feel cold spots in the room, but no one has seen the boy again. Do you believe in the paranormal? Do you ever notice something in the corner of your eyes, and when you turn, there is nothing? Or your pet staring at a corner of a room for a while?